Hello and welcome to Access Studio. My name is Nancy Gesimondo, and today I'm very pleased to be visiting the studio of James Seffens here in Long Island City, New York. Jim is a painter who is also known for his shadow box assemblages. He grew up in an Ohio enclave populated by his extended family. Jim describes his hometown as a DIY, grow-your-own sort of place. As a boy, he taught himself how to paint, carve, and build things out of wood. Jim attended the Ohio State University, where he obtained a degree in geology. But in 1978, Jim left the Midwest and moved to New York City. He began working with the sculptor Nicholas Cortez, who produced sculptural elements for store displays. It was there that he learned mold making, modeling, and casting. When Cortez passed in 1994, Jim maintained the storefront studio in Hell's Kitchen before relocating to Long Island City in 2011. Jim's current artistic output is quite varied. His work consists of paintings, box constructions, and papier-mâché sculptures. His paintings, inspired by American folk art, are made with the non-traditional medium of rust-proofing enamel on wood panels. For a number of years, Jim made toys using the same processes and materials as traditional toy makers of the early 19th century. He was featured on a segment of the Antiques Roadshow FYI, a spin-off that WGBH produced for PBS. Jim is a two-time grant recipient of the Hell's Kitchen Foundation. He has received a Techquity grant from the New York Creates eBay Foundation, and he was awarded a commission for a bronze relief sculpture for the Miser Park entrance in Wappingers Falls, New York. Jim's work has been featured in curated exhibitions internationally and solo shows throughout the New York City metropolitan area. His solo shows include a Chasama Project space in New York City, the Show of Hands Gallery in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and The Boy Who Liked Pretty Things, an exhibition curated by John Baber at the Departure Studio Gallery here in Long Island City. Jim's work is held in private collections internationally and nationwide. What fascinates me about Jim's work is how deeply personal it is. I am immediately drawn into the scene inside of his assemblage boxes. Jim often uses salvaged wood and weathered materials. Each one is a well-crafted time capsule that incorporates figures and relics, both found and artist-made objects. One group of boxes in particular pays tribute to a trove of family lore that Jim heard recounted by older relatives. The images and memorabilia become pieces of a narrative that is both compelling and, like all good art, remains a bit mysterious. Today he will share some of the stories that inspired this compelling body of work. Hi Jim, thank you so much for having me in your studio today.
It's my pleasure, Nancy. We're welcome.
So Jim, tell me about your childhood in the Midwest and how that led to your development as an artist and a maker.
My grandfather had a little wood shop and lived right across the road. Everybody lived on what had been the old farm. Even to this day, I would say the smell of linseed oil and turpentine and pine, particularly wood shaving, sawdust, will bring back memories of this little workshop from way back when. Also in my own home, my father made fishing lures, and he actually made fly fishing rods, which was a very intricate sort of work, tying little flies, and each one was very specific to a particular type of fish. My mother was a needle worker. She quilted, she crocheted, she made lace. I began very early on my own. I would find nails, boards, cans. I would clobber things together. I can't say they made a lot of sense, but I thought I was inventing something. And I used to refer to them as experiments. I had no other, sculpture would not have been in my vocabulary. And the little village school that I attended actually did not have instruction available.
Wow.
after 6th grade, there was no such thing. So, but that was about the time that I expanded my own exploration. I discovered nearby a paint store. One day, all of a sudden, they had a Grumbacher display, and everything was right there in this one little cabinet and corner, including a little paper pamphlet, How to Paint in Oils. So that was the beginning of actually painting.
That's great.
And I had a little corner of the cellar that used to be the coal bin, which was my area for my hobbies. And I'll tell you, the first time in my life, I started painting there one evening. I'd stretched my own canvas, which had actually come from a hospital sewing room. It was scrap.
Wow.
And I'd made my own frame. I stretched this thing.
And there was no YouTube then to check out how to do that.
No, there was a little pamphlet. You know, it was about 10 pages, all you need to know about oil painting. Anyway, I'm in the cellar, so there's no real light, and I'm very busy, and I painted, and next thing I knew, seemingly, I hear footsteps coming down the cellar steps, and it's morning. I had been all night long without any awareness of the time passing. So I knew this had quite a draw for me. Nothing else I ever experienced was so engrossing.
That's so cool.
That was, a desire was there. Now, how to make a life, a living, and all of those practical things were something else.
Indeed. What drives you to start a painting versus an assemblage box?
When I started painting, I started working with the medium that I'm using now. Early on, I just wanted to see what could happen. You know, so everything, again, I'm back to that idea that I'm experimenting, right? Or inventing. And great fun. But later on, as the technique developed and I started developing some processes for using these materials, I wanted something more. I wanted a larger sort of frame, so to speak. I wanted paintings relating to my own experience. So if I were painting a scene, it would be someplace where I had been, someplace that might be significant to me. I also went through old photos. I did paintings based on old family photos. The photos I'm talking about are from an era where photos were rather scarce. It was expensive to buy film, to get processing. It's not like today where we're just flooded with images to the point that, you know, what makes sense, what is significant. So with the painting, I am going back, I am looking at something, I'm looking at it closely, I'm dissecting it, and all together, you know, this is my story. So there might be some from New York, based on Ohio, based on Pennsylvania, based on road trips. Nancy, this is a painting that's a little further in progress than the one we were looking at earlier. This panel has been painted. There are actually 9 layers of paint here at this point. So my final part of my process, after all the color areas have been filled in, all the detail painted, was to paint the entire panel black. And the black serves as a guide for me for the next stage. And that stage is, I'm going to sand this down, but I'm going to sand it with some wet dry paper, and there's still soap on the brush. And we want to sand very uniformly. And as I sand, one thing that happens as I sand is I will get this kind of like muck, so I can't see what I'm doing. And that requires me every so often to wipe it off. And you will see starting to emerge is an image. And this image is coming from these under layers of paint. And again, just as we said before, these little details were the first things that were down there. And they've been hidden for a while. They got painted over.
And there is color, or is it just white?
Actually, this particular painting is in black and white.
Okay.
It's in black, white, and gray. And it's based, the idea here is based on a high school yearbook. And a bit of thought about this year where the kids were deprived of the graduation ceremony.
Wow.
But now, later on, I would use finer and finer grits of sandpaper. And as I go finer, the surface actually starts to develop a shine. It gets basically polished. But this one right now, it's the coarsest grade.
Wow, I can't believe after all of these processes and painting layers that you cover it with black. I had no idea when I looked at your work how you got those black marks.
Well, boxes, I think, have a different starting point. They do have different starting points, but also they're trying to do something a bit different. I tend to think of a box as having, because it is three-dimensional, the viewer's going to relate to it differently, for one thing, but also each thing that winds up in a box tends to have had its own story or history. Now, there were some boxes that were very, very deliberately built from the very start. There were some that actually began with the title, which seems like the totally reverse, but these were titled based on things that I had heard my mother tell me as I was a child, or from my grandfather, or from other relatives. And they were sayings that just stuck in my mind, just figures of speech, a way of expressing. And most of these had to do with family, with little stories that were kept alive. And later in life, my own studies, my own readings, I realized this is folklore. You know, these relate to the real life, the real history of honest to goodness people, not famous people, not, you know, no one anybody ever heard of, but in every life there is some drama, there might be tragedy, there might be success, and these little bits, these little memories or stories had kept them alive through generations in the family.
So they're like an excerpt of a visual memoir.
That would be a good description. I think they also relate to the idea of the reliquary, or in other traditions there would be shrines to ancestors in the home. There would be, and in fact in my home growing up there was a hallway which was hung with the oldest photos. We couldn't even identify some of the people, but photos that had all been family members, and my mother referred to it as her rogues gallery, which also an old expression, and there they were.
That's so cool. So who are some of the artists that helped shape your ways of making?
Joseph Cornell, when I first saw his work, it seemed to me the most perfect. It made total sense. It also seemed as if it had always existed. It was almost hard to believe somebody had just made that. Later on, I discovered the work of H.C. Westerman. Westerman was a woodworker, and he incorporates amazing craft into the sculpture. One of his biggest artworks actually was the house that he built and studio. But his work is probably not as well known as Cornell.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with him.
I've seen other constructions, some wonderful ones that Lucas Samaras built. And in that vein, I think that those would be the three people I think of as construction constructive or assemblage type work.
So I noticed some of your other boxes are not about family. They're about completely different subject matter. So what is it about those pieces that, were the inspiration? Was it like pieces that you just found and collected, and then another story grew out of those pieces? Or was it from a piece of literature that you found interesting and thought, oh, that would be an interesting box to make?
It very often, as an object becomes the center of the box, I might build them around one thing that I have found. I do have bits and pieces. We could call them bits and bobs. I love that expression. They're odd little things that I collected. Some of them I've had for years and years. Some of them also are little parts that I made. They might have been made originally for a different purpose and were not used. Sometimes it's even a reject from some other project that I still felt was worth holding on to. Interesting thing or not, it was a great effect, but it could only be done on a very small surface. Larger surfaces did not allow that, but I like it enough. I would feature that as the background in a box. This little guy, little paper mache guy, he's bending over, touching his toes or stretching. He is a good example of something made for another piece, but turned out not to be needed.
With newspaper.
This one is a wire armature, and it was made so far with newspaper. Now I might want to do a thin layer of an acid-free paper on top.
So you won't see the text?
Yeah. This I know if it's exposed to light, it would really yellow. And sometimes with this sort of work, I could go back in again and refine it, make some little changes. This too is something, it's like a flea market find. And the color, the age, even the antique staple here, they could all speak to me in the right setting. But it's to build a story with it and to present the pieces, each one as if it were a special sort of find or discovery by itself. And if there can be a narrative, I like there to be more than one. You know, not just one interpretation, but if you could take different things from it, that makes me happy.
So tell me about the meaning of this piece.
It takes its title from something that my mother had told me about a relative that she knew when she was a young girl, actually. This relative was cousin Lulu. And my mother used, now recall this was her childhood recollection, but she used a euphemism that dates back to the 19th century, early 20th century, when she said, Cousin Lulu was kept in. Now, in the day, that expression, somebody who was kept in, would likely have been emotionally or developmentally disabled. And there was not much opportunity in the day. Families, their other option would have been institutionalization, most likely. It has some dark overtones. Even that concept today we would think was really primitive. I have no indication that this woman was mistreated in any way. But I wanted to leave that open. In terms of building the box and what I have included. So, and sometimes I like to do a little bit of humor, which might be, well, you might have to know a context for that as well. But in the background is needlework. It's an embroidery which I produced. To begin with the idea of a needlepoint sampler. So I started with letters, A, B, C, and then they begin to deteriorate. And they begin to become something other.
Wow.
And now part of that idea, it's a Midwestern, and this relates to folk art and folk custom, because there was a saying that when a young woman was old enough to execute a sampler, she was old enough.
To get married, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that would have been at 13, 14.
Yeah. Wow.
But if this were Cousin Lulu's sampler,
Yeah.
that's not going to happen.
Right. Wow. It's exquisite. It's so cool, and I love the significance of the lock door. And
there is a little room in here.
what?
So there is a low watt, like a night light fixture inside the tower here. If it were dark, this part would just glow, and you would be able to look inside these two holes into what I modeled. There's a continuation of this baseboard element, and then there are three walls, and behind, in relief, I created what would seem to be a door. But all of those surfaces are covered with paper, as if it were all wallpapered, as if that door
Didn't exist.
Yes,
Whoa.
as if that door had become part of the wall.
Oh my gosh.
And I created actually a duplicate of this idea, because you see, if you're in a room and there's no doorknob,
That's right.
you're not getting out.
Oh.
So as I said,
it's a
it
little
could have a
dark.
dark element.
Yeah.
But the curious thing is, people will look in, they say there's nothing there. It is a bit subtle, but also that was part of what I was trying to get across.
Right.
That there could be a room that people learn is not there.
Whoa.
You know, we don't go in that door.
Right.
That's not a door. So I want to add too that the photograph, this is not Cousin Lulu, the real Cousin Lulu. But with that idea, with the story in my mind, and I would have to say in my heart, because I grew up with it, in looking through bins of photos at the flea market, I found a face that I thought I wanted to be part of this story.
Wow. Right.
So she is, as we say, a found object there.
Right. Because no one ever really saw Cousin Lulu anyway.
No, and unlikely that she ever would have been photographed. Even though the family did photograph relatives, there were little carte de visite and cabinet photos, but no, not that I know of.
Wow. It's an exquisite piece. It's a wonderful story. Is it one you would sell, or is it something you're keeping?
I had an idea at one time that I wanted to do a number of boxes starting with these family stories. I still have a list of ideas coming from there. Back to your question about would I sell it, the reason I had held on to it was thinking, I want 12. I want a show that is, all along this idea.
There's also this box that I'm curious about. This catches my eye because it's very, I'll move this one back, but that one is very, I'm attracted to the composition of it very much.
Well, thank you. This one is titled Private Library, relating literally to a private library in a 18th century home upstate, where I was doing some conservation work on some antique frames. So I'm going to tilt this a little bit so we can both see. But the whole background panel, which looks old, that is actually a finish I created to match the little pieces that I needed to carve to add to these frames. to match the existing finish. So, and I'd saved that little finish panel for the longest time, but it was one of those pieces that kind of kicked around. And my favorite part of this house was the library, and it was absolutely a dedicated library. You walk in, it smells like old leather and wonderful books. So the other lining is the kind of end pages you would find in a 19th century book with marbled paper, and then other elements. There is a little bit of text from a matchbook, and then other items I fabricated. That little tiny dog head, actually, I was carving for another box entitled Aunt Dora Died of a Broken Heart. But in the end, it was the wrong size. I didn't like it. So it wound up here. And the little plaque, too, it's a bronze, and it's based on a small pattern carving that I made. Wow. The wood is old, and in working with old wood, sometimes I love the texture, but when you cut, you're going to be exposing surfaces that are going to look different. So I slice it really thin so we don't see too much of that. I want to instead, I'm going to turn it because I even like that it had some old paint splashed on it. But the texture, and again, this one, I think it's really about a feeling. It's almost the way I felt about this library.
Where do you sell your work, or where would one be able to go to see your work?
Currently, they would have to just contact me. I have a long history of studio sales. I would have an open studio every year. Right now, I do not have one planned. Sure. Unfortunately, but people could contact me. I'm happy to respond to emails. Put them on my list for notice, or even studio visits could still be arranged.
Well, thank you so much for having me in your studio today. I really enjoyed getting this in-depth look into the processes of your work. Thank you so much, Jim.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to talk to you and to have you as a guest in my studio.
Thank you for tuning in to Access Studio today. I hope you enjoyed this episode with James Seffens in his studio in Long Island City, and I hope you tune in again for our next episode.